This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. I'm your host, MaryJane. When most of us think about relationships, we grow up with one script. You meet one person, fall in love, stay faithful, and build a life together. But for millions of people around the world, relationships don't always follow that script. Some people choose polyamory. Some have open relationships. Others live within cultures or faiths where polygamy is part of family life. Yet, these very different relationship structures are often lumped together, misunderstood, or dismissed altogether. Today, we're unpacking first times beyond monogamy, what it's like to experience love shared, what surprises people, what challenges them, and what myths get in the way of understanding these relationships. We're joined once again by the incredible Dr. Markie, renowned award-winning sexologist, relationship therapist, author, and international speaker, and editor-in-chief of Sexual Relationship Therapy. Welcome, Dr. Markie. It's lovely to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here, MaryJane. Thank you, and thank you, listeners.
So, I'd like us to start with the basics. What's the difference between polyamory and polygamy, open relationships, swinging, and non-monogamy or ethical non-monogamy? And of course, oftentimes people will confuse these. So what are some of the misconceptions that frustrate you the most about these differences?
Oh my goodness. Well, we could be here a while. So buckle up, everybody. I actually like to think about, before we get into all the differences in the polyamory world, just what even is monogamy? Because in a way, that's almost less clear. And rarely do people have over rules, roles, and boundaries that they discuss around monogamy, particularly in cisgender heterosexual marriages and partnership. And there's like a lot of assumptions then in monogamy and what it is and what it's not. So, like, is being friends with an ex on socials a form of cheating? Is having a companion synthetic, like generative AI partner, cheating? What about self sex? What about watching porn independently? What about VR based digisexuality or virtual reality? What about emotional versus physical non monogamy? What counts? And part of the reason that's super hard to even answer is that monogamy is actually the global minority. In fact, 1 in 6 global societies enforce monogamy as a rule, which is roughly 16% of the globe. Yet, here in the US and many westernized places, in a marital and partnered context, monogamy is where both partners are married or committed to one mate, which is each other. And honestly, that's really unusual because really what's practiced is actually serial monogamy, So I'm monogamous for this person in this way in a certain time, and then we break up or divorce or whatever might happen. And then we're monogamous again with the next person. And in addition, because there's a lack of clarity on what is monogamy, then it's actually really hard to say what's non-consensual non-monogamy or cheating or infidelity in a marital or partnership context. And research over time has looked at the fact that the range of non-consensual non-monogamy in supposedly married context is like 40 to 60% of people cheat or commit infidelity. And that can be gendered difference. But I would almost argue nobody's really monogamous in that pure sense of whatever that word means. In terms of the polyamory versus polygamy, where you kind of started with terminology, people could kind of argue that a few ways. I, and not just me, several other people would say that polyamory is actually the larger umbrella, where really non monogamy is the largest umbrella. And then underneath that, I would put polyamory, and then polygamy is one form of polyamory. And one of the resources that I'll share with you and listeners can have access to too, of course, is Franklin Vu, and that's Veaux, back in like 2010, 2011, put together a whole entire table infographic. He called it a map of non-monogamy, and it includes polygamy and a whole bunch of other forms that we're going to talk about. And it's actually a really helpful tool to just look at because it explains so much of the different dynamics with all the different kinds of polyamory. And so it's a real bang up tool that people can access. But if we start with polyamory as the larger umbrella, then all of those other things, open relationships, polygamy, ethical non monogamy, swinging, all those things fit under that larger umbrella. Consensual non monogamy or ethical non monogamy, that basically refers to in a relationship there's an explicit allowance for extradyadic, romantic, or sexual relationships. And consensual or ethical non monogamy can take different forms depending on the needs and the preferences of the people in the relationship. And I know last time that we talked, Dr. Alexian Toffee was with us too. Both of us sort of had, and others do too, have the same kind of critique of even that term, though, because we don't say consensual or ethical monogamy. And so it sort of has this othering effect to like only use that terminology when it's referring to non monogamy, because really, wouldn't we want all of our relationships to be consensual and ethical, right? Regardless of whether it's monogamous or non monogamous. So that's just sort of me picking a little bit, but I do think it matters. When you look at polygamy, and this one of all the ones that you mentioned as a term and then a relational dynamic, that one makes people in Western culture particularly uncomfortable. There's a lot of judgments from polyamorous folks in the West around the idea of polygamy, but I would actually argue that the majority of the world is polygamous. That's the oldest form of kind of recorded non monogamy. And over 850 different societies within Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Middle East practice some version of polygamy. That's how common it is. I mean, almost everyone. So polygamy is where a person is married, and whether that's religious and or legally depends on the place on the globe. So they're married to multiple people and the gender can vary. When it's polygyny, that's where it's one man and more than one woman, and that's the most common form of polygamy in the world. It's more practiced in Islamic and African-based societies. In those societies, researchers have found that up to 50% of marriages are polygynous. There are certainly places where polygyny is completely legal. But then there are also some countries like India and Sri Lanka, for example, where they might ban polygamy, including polygyny, but they'll have legal exceptions for certain religious groups, like the Muslim Personal Law of 1937, for example, in Sri Lanka, makes it so that if you're Muslim, you can practice polygyny because it aligns with your religious context, right? And your cultural context. We don't have that in the US, which we'll get into. Polyandry is another form of polygamy. This is way less common. This is where it's one woman and more than one man. And that's typically in societies where women wield more economic power. There's some other ways that can show up, but like Tibet practiced legal polyandry up until 1950 when China invaded and then began occupying. In a study, and this is old, but there's no way to do research on it now because Tibet can't practice their polyandry under Chinese occupation. But back in 1988, a researcher looked at 753 different Tibetan families and found that 13% practice polyandry, one woman, more than one man. There are other places in the globe where, in minoritized communities, polyandry exists. India, Bhutan, Nepal, Nigeria, Namibia, China, Kenya, Tanzania, Brazil. And interestingly, where I'm situated in Alaska, there's even a history of Inuit and Aleut First Nations groups practicing polyandry up until the 19th century. And lots of times in these kind of communities, whether it's polygyny, polyandry, whether it's one man and multiple wives or one wife and multiple husbands, a lot of times, and this will tie back to the conversation we had where it's a more experienced person who's bringing someone into their firsts, when we talked about gender differences and number of people and how that plays a part in those kind of contexts. That's what happens a lot here. So a lot of times where there's a big gender gap in a community, where there's a scarcity of men, there tends to be more polygyny. And when there's a scarcity of women, there tends to be more polyandry. And so in Alaska, as I think we've talked about before, even growing up in like the 80s and 90s here, in the 1900s, the last century, our ratio when I was young was 10 men to every one woman. And so we tended to practice polyandry. It wasn't like in a marital sense, but because of that gender and scarcity gap, in Alaska, the saying growing up was, in Alaska, you don't lose your girl, you just lose your place in line. Because that's how many men there were compared to women, right? It's a scarcity of research. And so women, in many ways, end up wielding more power over who they want to partner with. Their partners tend to get younger. As men, they tend to get more of them. And so this is really honestly not unusual. Many First Nations cultures have been practicing some version of polygamy for a very, 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 very long time. Open relationships are probably the most difficult of all these kind of to define. One of the things I like to talk about with people is relational orientation. Like, are you oriented in terms of relationships? Do you have a feeling of being more monogamous, like one person serially at a time? Or do you have more of a feeling of having more than one partner? And that's the way you're oriented as a human. And when you get to open relationships, you get this whole monogamish, where it's somewhere kind of in the middle. This is typically where it's two people that have a primary partnership with each other. And then they have agreements outside of that relationship that they've come to with each other. And so oftentimes open relationship is hierarchical non-monogamy, where you have two people and they're primary partners, and then they might have secondary partners, or they might, have affectional partners or play partners. And that can absolutely happen. So it's a little less clear. One of the ones that didn't get kind of attention would be solo polyamory. That's where you're committed to yourself first. So you don't have a primary partner except yourself. You might have different partners independent from each other. And this has been my preferred form of non-monogamy on and off for like pretty much my whole life, honestly. And I think of it as being a sailor in a port or having like a vacation relationship where I have people I spend time with in certain places. We really enjoy each other. We have partners other places, and there isn't this hierarchy. No one's more important, in my point of view, than another partner. They just meet sort of different needs, resources, so on and so forth. And then swinging, sometimes referred to as wife swapping, husband swapping, partner swapping. This is where people will often engage in sexual activities in which both singles and partners in committed relationships engage with others in that recreational activity. This really started to become more present in the US in the 1950s. Swinging is not for me. I definitely have taught a lot of tantra-informed workshops in swingers resorts and clubs in many places like Toronto, Las Vegas, Sydney, at Desire Resorts in Mexico. And for many, many, many people in my classes, they really seem to enjoy what they would call their swinging lifestyle. This might not be everyone's cup of tea, but the people that I worked with, they were happy to do this. They were happy to like wife swap or husband swap in this setting, mainly for fun. I think for me, just personally, where this starts to get tricky is it kind of brings up that what is non-monogamy? Is it a kink fetish? Swinging, threesomes, group sex, these kind of things sometimes can be more of a kink fetish and less about a relational orientation because it isn't necessarily about we're going to have this long relationship with this other couple and we're going to form a polyam family. It's more we're going to have a good time together. And I totally respect that some people are totally good with fetishizing quality, but for other people, that's not really going to be a good fit. Why do people confuse these and what are misconceptions that frustrate me? Well, dominant cultures here on this side and really like North America, but maybe not some places like Quebec might be an exception, for example. We tend to be really mononormative. So we believe that monogamy is the norm. But I would actually argue global places in the East are kind of polygamy normative. And so they kind of believe that that is the way it's going to be. I'm going to have, and typically it's I'm going to have multiple wives. And that's just the way it's going to be. And the part of the problem then is no matter where you grow up, you're not really getting conversation or exposure or education on the broad range of what non monogamy looks like. You're sort of boxed into this okay, I grew up in a monogamous context, or what I thought was this mononormative way. So I think that's all it is. And I don't understand that things can be different, or you grow up in this polygamous, and I don't really understand how it can be different. I pick on education all the time. I wish we had more just cultural education around this so people understood some of these differences, which kind of brings me to the misconception that frustrates me probably the most, the whole polygamy versus polyamory. Why can't these groups of people be in this together? And I would argue that, polyamorous folks in the West judge polygamy because they have a lot of ideas about power and control and religion and all this other stuff. But these people are having the same fight. They want their rights. They want to be recognized no matter where you are on the globe. They want to be seen the way that matches who they are in their own relational orientation. And in part because they don't speak to each other and they think they're so different, it just doesn't help any of us. And I really think it's just in the West, it's our monogamism. which is this dominant belief that this only relational orientation that's acceptable is being monogamous. And that can show up in all sorts of ways. Binarizing, when you see forms, it'll say single or married or divorced. It's either this, or this. Misidentifying, assuming when you see three people that look like adults with a kid, well, there's no way that's a family. It can't be. Just misidentifying it, not recognizing for what it can be. Or when you see them, you just say, oh, that group of people over there. So you de-relationalize. There's no way those people can really be anything else. Objectifying. Like when I would hang out with my primary partner and a parenting partner, people always thought we were having threesomes together. And it's like, no, we're just a polyam network that's raising a kid together. Stop objectifying how attractive we are and thinking that, you can live out your sexual fantasies just by looking at us in a polyam family. Probably the biggest way monogamism shows up is ethnofamilialism, this idea of ethnocentrism. The way I evaluate other people's culture and standards is by my own. And then familialism, the way I judge other families is by the way that I have my own family. Marginalizing. So if it's any construction of a family that looks different than the dominant norm, we treat it as some sort of marked category or effect to be explained. The poly community, and I caution people on use of the word poly because when I talk to people who come from Polynesian descent, identity, background, and experience, they would really prefer that the polyam community not steal their word of poly and use polyam. And then when we get real icky about Western ideas on polygamy, you'll hear people say things like plague. That's a plague cult, or those are plagues. And that's marginalizing too. And who wants to be talked about in those ways and thought of in those ways? It's othering and it's gross. The two last ways monogamism shows up, at least in North America, is erasure. Even in the research, in intake assessments, a lot of times there's not inclusion of, we're back to that. Are you single, partnered, married, or divorced? It's like you're just not acknowledged if you're someone that doesn't match. And then finally, pathologizing. Certainly, there's no clinical diagnosis around relational orientation. There's no, oh, you have polyamory disorder in the DSM or the ICD. It doesn't exist. However, lots of times when people come into a practice and they report some version of polyamory, the therapist will give them diagnoses like relational distress with a partner, child affected by parental relational distress because their parents are non-monogamous. Borderline personality disorder is a real popular one that people like to give to someone who identifies as polyamorous. And paraphilia disorders, fetish disorder like nymphomania. You must have such a high sex drive that there's something wrong with you. And so all of those assumptions are not good. They hurt a lot of us. And you can also have internalized monogamism. You could be like, I feel like my orientation is towards non monogamy, but I have all of these feelings that come from that dominant mononormative culture that tell me that, I'm only supposed to hold hands with one person at a time. And if I don't do that, then there's something wrong with me. I know that was a lot, but there's a lot.
Yeah, so this kind of segues into some of the myths that I want us to talk about. You mentioned how, for the most part, especially in the West, that monogamy is the norm, right? So then there's the assumption that if you're non-monogamous, it's because you're actually sexually unsatisfied or that you just want an excuse to cheat. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that kind of belief or mythos is definitely a part of Western culture. The idea is they choose non monogamy because they're sexually unsatisfied or they're doing it because it's just cheating. And as I started with around monogamy, you can cheat either way. I mean, If you don't have clear agreements and you don't revisit what those mean, especially with technology, people can have synthetic partners and one person might think that's not cheating at all and the other person might think, "Oh no, that is." So I would argue you can cheat either way. I don't think it's just cheating because that happens in non-consensual non-monogamy happens a lot. It can be sometimes. I wouldn't say it's necessarily sexual unsatisfaction, but it might be more desire or erotic discrepancy where one person in a dyad might have interest in having more sex, or they might have interest in having different kind of sex, like erotic type activities that might not even involve sex. And so sometimes people might have interest in non-monogamy because they have a desire or an erotic discrepancy. I'll also point out that there are people who are asexual that are in non-monogamous relationships too, because they're doing it as a form of affection and as a form of partnership. And it might not be about sex at all. And so maybe they're like, I want my partner to have other kinds of relationships outside of this that might be sexual. That can happen too.
I mean, of course, one would argue that yes, as human beings, you get attracted to more than one person, even when you're married to one person, right?
Right.
But then perhaps, and this is, kind of another myth, that those who engage in non-monogamy, for them, it means less commitment to each individual because your time and your energy and your emotional investment is shared among multiple people. It's harder to be devoted to one person, and then you can get away with doing whatever because you're non-monogamous, and it's okay because you've all agreed, right? And
Right.
there's no
Right.
need to kind of be devoted and dedicated to this one person.
So this can actually, I think this is always surprising to people. Sometimes the more people you involve in relational dynamics, actually, the more commitment you have. Because now you have to share commitments to multiple people in different ways. And it's actually a lot to manage. And because some relationships are hierarchical, and typically, that's a lot of the way it looks. Like it'll be a dyad that has a primary partnership with each other. They have explicit rules around here's what this means. You're going to watch. It can even get this technical. You're going to only eat these foods with me. I don't want you to share these foods with someone else. I had a partner where we both had spent tons of time in Alaska together. And his one rule was, I don't want you to share crab or salmon with anyone else. That meant a lot. There can be agreements around, I don't want you to watch this show with anyone else. We're going to watch this show together. And you're not going to watch it with anyone else. So these commitments can look a lot more nuanced. I'm not sure it's a matter of less or more unless it's a hierarchy. And then when it's a hierarchy, that primary relationship usually takes front and center. And there can also be veto in that relationship. So the partner can say, nope, I'm not okay with that person being a secondary partner or an erotic play partner or an affectional partner that you just cuddle with or an emotional partner that you just share love with. That can absolutely show up. I think no matter what kind of dynamic it is, whether it's non monogamy or monogamy, I am so allergic to cheating as a human. And you'd think it was because I went through some horrible cheating thing. Yeah, sure, we've all been cheated on, right? But that's not even it. I think it's because I grew up with my grandparents. They pretty much raised me, so we can blame them. And Sid and Del, they weren't each other's first marriage for all sorts of reasons, but they strongly believed in honoring agreements, period. And the way they judged cheating, regardless of the context, it didn't matter if it was sexual, romantic, card playing, taxes, whatever. Their feeling was people who cheat lack courage and conviction. And I would argue that that's true. And so, no matter what, around that degree of commitment, if you're not honoring whatever the participants in the non monogamous situation say is the commitment, then you need to exercise more courage and conviction in having an overt conversation about what that needs to look like for you and your partner slash partners. I'm not a cheater. So boring. And that's why. Yeah.
There's a lot of agreements that come with non-monogamy too. For someone who first realizes that monogamy may not be right for them when they're already in it, what are some of the common emotions that come up? What are some of the biggest fears that come up in these relationships?
And again, because we think it's not weird to be monogamous and oriented that way, because it actually is weird globally. I think when people kind of wake up to this feeling, if it happens that way in adulthood, one of my partners is Muslim, and he would say, "Yeah, it's probably similar to waking up and realizing you're Muslim, because that's how that culture believes too. Like, they think everyone's Muslim, and then you wake up on one day and you realize you're Muslim." I imagine it's like that in many ways for people that wake up and realize, "Oh, no, I'm not monogamous. What do I do about it?" I think there's a lot of confusion. I think there's internalized monogamism and a bit of shame, like, "I failed." And I would say, no, you woke up to something that the majority of the world already feels. And one of the things that typically comes up is they'll say, I want to open the relationship up. I will say that especially when het cis couples say that, and my colleague, Dr. Colton and Sheneke and I joke around about this a lot. Back in the 80s, 70s, 60s, in the last century, couples would come in and they would say something like, we're having problems. We think we're going to have a baby, and that would help. Sure. Sometimes bringing a third person into your life might help that dynamic. Although I would argue, not really. Work on whatever's going on first before you bring a third. And honestly, in the last century, the new, I think we're going to have a baby when people have problems turns into, I think we're going to open our relationship up. And so, on the one hand, sure, but understand, and this is a caution, one of you might feel yourself not be non-monogamous, but the other person might truly be a person, and it's rare, who does feel monogamous. And so just trying to manage the difference in relational orientation can be challenging. Even if you believe in, opening the relationship up, how is that gonna look? And no one really can be sure exactly, like, is it gonna be more like a kink leisure activity? Like, we're gonna involve a third person occasionally? Or is it gonna look like we're gonna have whole separate partners and families? And so that's hard. And I think a lot of times people think, oh, we're both non-monogamous. So they think they're gonna be non-monogamous in the same way. And that really isn't always the case. Like, my last partner I was with for like 5+ years, our versions of polyamory looked very different. His version was kink fetish. It was inviting third people in. It was like group dynamics. It was a desire to swing. And for me, I already described how I am. I'm a solo polyamorist. And that made him crazy and vice versa. And so just because you might be with a partner who wakes up one day and realizes they're not monogamous, and then what do we do? Doesn't mean that the other partner is gonna feel that way, or they're gonna feel that way in the same way. And so it's way less fun if you're doing it right and healthy than people think, because it's gonna involve a lot of conversation, a lot of talk. It's a lot of foreplay before you get to the actual foreplay. One of the tools that I like to use is the gender, sexual, erotic, relational diversity matrix. And I will totally share that, and people can access that, because it's a tool that just lets people know where they are in terms of their own gender, their own sexuality, their own erotic orientation and relational orientation. And it's easy to map it on your own. It doesn't involve any numbers, folks. I have dyscalculia, and I'm not going to do that to anybody. It's just an easy tool. And I find it really, really, really helpful. And then you can map the other person or people's, and you can even map the whole relationship together and just look at how do we talk through some of these differences and similarities?
You touched on compersion earlier, how you may find pleasure in your partner getting pleasure from somebody else. But is it really common, or is jealousy inevitable?
Oh, this is such a great question. For some weird reason, people think that, oh, if you're non monogamous, you must not be jealous. Wow, is that not true? Just because you've owned jealousy as a natural, normal human feeling, which it is, regardless of the context, it doesn't have to just be sexual or romantic jealousy. It can be a whole bunch of different things that you can feel jealousy. They think that if you're non-monogamous, you're not gonna feel that way, and I would argue the only difference is you acknowledge the feeling and you're able to actually talk about it. And so I appreciate that because I am definitely a jealous human. I would never pretend not to be. It would be lying. But I also understand compersion, and compersion is more common than people realize. And again, if you take all these things out of a sexual romantic context, sometimes it's easier and less threatening internally for people to think about. Jealousy has been around as long as people have existed. Compersion, at least in this language, didn't make its debut until the 1990s. And it was a term created from within the polyam communities. But compersion is really this in a nutshell. Have you ever had a best friend? Probably Mary Jane. Yeah, I would imagine you have a best friend. Yeah, of course, I do too.
Yes.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course you do. Okay, but do you have other best friends? Like maybe a couple people that are like,
Yes.
okay, that are your ride
Yeah.
or die if something happens. All right. Yeah, yeah, me too. Me too. Okay, I'm not to the point where I collect friends, but I definitely have a few people in my life that I am very close to, and I love them. Now, let's say your best friend is about to meet your other best friend for the very first time, and maybe they've never met each other. And you are, like, so excited about it because 'cause you're like, "Oh, finally, my best friends are gonna meet. I can hardly wait." And they meet each other, and let's say they love each other. They hit it off immediately. I'm sure you've had this happen, and you're like, "This is great. I'm so excited. We're all loving each other." That feeling that you get when you see your best friends love each other is compersion. That is the feeling of watching 2 people that you already love and care about each other too. And I love that feeling. I love compersion, and that can happen with partners. So one of your partners meets your other partner, and all of a sudden they really like each other. However, the other side can happen because let's say that your best friends start hanging out without you, right? And maybe you have some feelings of jealousy now, right? You can still be jealous, but you can also have compersion, and there's room for both. But I think the more important conversation is talking about it. And before you talk about it, there's some just questions you can ask that I think are super helpful. And they seem simple, but they're not mine. They actually came from Mary Brown, who was with Sister Wives and still is with the show for a very long time. And polygamy, particularly fundamentalist Mormon polygamy, was my gateway into understanding polyamory. So I'm a weird Western liberal person, right? Which is why I probably talk so much about polygamy because I'm like, no, polygamy has like rules, roles, and boundaries been in. It's been around for a long time. It's kind of nice, right? Because you kind of know what to expect. It's not sort of just being made up in the Wild West, more like polyamory. But Mary Brown started doing these symposiums called Worthy Up. And a lot of it's a reflection on her experiences in a plural marriage. That's what it's called within a fundamentalist Mormon context. And I was invited to go to one in February of 2025, so not long ago. And it was in Vegas. And one of the things that she shared, which I thought it's just so simple. But she said, when you're feeling yourself be jealous, and I would think she would know, she was the first wife for a very long time in a eventually 4-wife family. She would say, if you start to feel jealous, ask yourself, what does this jealousy tell me? What does it tell me? And I like that question. It's simple, but it's hard. And then she added on the other side of that, when you feel yourself have compersion, what does that compersion tell you? And sometimes that can be jealousy and compersion at the same time towards the same person or people. But I do think it's important to, before you even have the conversations with the people involved, reflect on these kinds of questions for yourself. And I'll definitely share the info about Worthy Up as well, because those symposiums are pretty powerful.
So, what are some of the biggest surprises that people experience after entering a consensually non monogamous relationship?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think people think it's going to be easy. Yeah, I think the biggest one is they're like, "Oh, finally, this will be so easy. Like, we'll both get to do these fun things, whatever that means, either together or separate. I'm not going to feel stifled or controlled or whatever power dynamic people might struggle with, or I'll finally have all my desires and erotic needs met in somehow way." And I would argue, again, it's a lot more work than this. If you're going to do it right, if you're going to really follow like sexual health principles and guidelines, this takes a lot more work. The other thing I think that really surprises people, or maybe it won't, at least where it tends to be more of a dyadic kind of man woman dynamic, particularly when men are not homoflexible or gay in any way. They'll start going on dating apps, and so will their partner that's a woman who maybe is more flexible in those ways, just because that's what the research shows. And the women will get all these people that have interest, and the men don't get any. And so what's always so interesting is it brings up this dissonance, like, oh, I thought we'd both be, and that's not often what happens. So that inconsistency or dissonance, I think, is a huge surprise. And again, I'm speaking very intentionally in a particular group. It's not the same when you go into gay communities, right? They can just both get on Grinder and have a good time, probably. I mean, so, I've never been on Grinder, but I am tempted, because I'm a gay man in a woman's body who wants to be a drag queen, and that's my androgyny one day, maybe. I think the other big sort of surprise is the realization of monogamous privilege that you might not have been aware of when you live monogamously or serially monogamously. So you don't realize there's all these unearned benefits. Like, people don't question the validity or stability of your relationship. They don't make assumptions about how you parent, about your sexuality, about the character of who you are. You don't have to fear legal, social, economic consequences if someone finds out that you're non monogamous. And what happens, and I had this happen, when you have two partners that you really like and you'd like to be able to marry or domestically partner with both, because you want your kid to be recognized by all the parents, or you want them to, have health insurance, which you have to have in this country in order to survive. Just the lack of available greeting cards for special occasions, or setting up romantic getaways. Romantic getaways don't ever say, "Oh, and how many adults? It'll be 3." No, it's assumed it's going to be 2 people. And so I think a lot of people, you don't know the air you breathe when it's any kind of privilege until you're not really living that privilege. And then you wake up again, we're back to waking up, and you go, "Oh, okay, this is a lot harder, than I maybe realized." My colleague, who I already mentioned, Colton Shenicky, and I, we put together, and I'll share it, a Polyam-Centric role play. So it's a world where everyone is polyamorous, and this couple comes into a session. It's a fake session and a fake therapist, right? And the therapist makes all these assumptions about their monogamous relationship. And they're the exact opposite kind that we get around polyamory. And it's really eye-opening to see it, especially for people who maybe have gone into this thinking, "Oh, we're going to be fine." It's a lot harder than you realize. There's a lot more stigma and shame than people realize.
So, then there's also the myth that open relationships or non monogamous relationships always fail eventually. that people feel pressure to experience compersion, but instead they end up feeling jealousy. And then in the long run, it all falls apart. Is that really true?
No, that's not true. Open relationships definitely don't always fail, just like having kids when your marriage is struggling doesn't always lead to divorce. It really depends on the people. And I would say monogamous relationships fail a lot too, like half of marriages end in divorce. There's an anthropologist who was at UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Jankovic, and he studied fundamentalist Mormon families, so plural marriage, and he looked at comparing them to families that were monogamous. And basically, what he found was about a third of any of these kinds of marriages, whether it's, and these were open fundamentalist Mormons, not Mormons that live on compounds like we see on TV. I'm talking about the people who live openly, which is rare. But about a third of those families, just like monogamous families or supposedly monogamous families, are pretty happy and healthy. They're doing pretty good. About a third, whether it's a fundamentalist Mormon family, plural marriage, or a monogamous family, are struggling. About a third, they're having relational problems, they're having some issues, so on and so forth. They could use some therapy and probably do better. And then about a third are really unhealthy. There's significant problems going on. Sometimes there's abuse, sometimes there's neglect, sometimes just there's such uneven power dynamics that it's bad. And so, really, you can see that whether it's a monogamous or non monogamous context for sure. And that's just one example of like some non monogamous research. And I think helpful because, again, if people are having a lot of feelings about polygamy versus polyamory, I invite you to explore why you're having those feelings.
So now, Dr. Markie, we're going to do some rapid fire questions. So
Yeah,
very short answers to each of
perfect.
the each of the questions. So are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Go.
Okay, so the first one, what's the most surprising research finding on non-monogamy?
There's not enough. I think just the stuff that I even shared around the fundamentalist Mormon, how a third can be healthy relational dynamics, a third can be kind of like not so healthy, but it's manageable and you can get help and it can be worked on. And then a third is pretty unhealthy, but that pretty much matches monogamous
Yeah.
research.
And then one thing monogamous couples could learn from polyamorous, polygamous relationships.
I think one of the biggest things I just think in general is if you can't talk about sex, you probably shouldn't be having it. And the moment you get to polyamory, you're pretty much you've agreed to be talking about sex.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that that is something that monogamous couples can strongly benefit from.
And then one thing people should never assume about someone in a non-monogamous relationship.
I don't think people should assume that they're like you started with those myths of like they just don't have a good sex life unless there's more people or they're a cheater. I don't think we should assume any of those things. Honestly, we probably shouldn't assume anything about anyone really ever, but those are probably the biggest ones that I think people or that they have it easier, or somehow this is like easier, or jealousy disappeared.
Yeah.
No, no, not easier. Jealousy doesn't disappear overnight.
And then, of course, you already mentioned a number of resources for our listeners. And of course, we're going to have links on those, as I said. But what other, or maybe one other one,
Yeah.
so that people are better
Yeah.
informed?
3 or 4 years ago, I got invited by the College of Sexual and Relationship Therapists, and that's based in the UK. I also am part of their trustee board and I run their journal as the editor in chief, the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy. But I did a whole class, a self access class for them on polyamory. But one of the things that came from that was just a blog to celebrate Polyamory Day, and International Polyamory Day is November 23. And they asked me to do a blog, and that'll also have a lot of what we just talked about. I like to make sure that the resources are things that people can access. I wish academic journals were accessible, but a lot of times they're not. And that's unfortunate. So, yeah, I'll make that available to you for sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Markie. It's been a very interesting conversation, a lot that we unpacked,
Yeah.
a lot of new things that I learned too as well. So I appreciate you and I appreciate sharing your insights with the listeners.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you and I appreciate the listeners and I appreciate this whole conversation. Thank you.
Today's conversation wasn't about telling anyone how they should love. It was about understanding that relationships come in many forms and that healthy relationships, whether monogamous or non-monogamous, depend on the same foundations: honesty, communication, respect, consent. So a huge thank you to Dr. Markie for helping us separate myth from reality. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's curious about the many ways people experience love and intimacy. We also have a bonus episode because my conversation with Dr. Markie lasted for hours. We simply had too much to fit into one episode. In our bonus episode, Love Shared, we dive even deeper into the realities, myths, and dynamics of non-monogamy. So if you'd like to hear more, be sure to check it out. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.